Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning. Welcome to a quick discussion on recovery time. So what is recovery time? How do you use it? Because this is one of those simulation aspects that's very unique to the way that Tactics Ogre feels. Namely, when it comes to your movement, everything is a lot more simulated than it may seem, and this is why, for example, when many new players come into the whole thing, many of them are familiar with an FFT-style system or a turn-based system, and a lot of times they will find themselves getting just completely outsped by the AI, and they're not really sure why. So let's go ahead and explain this real quick. So this is going to be a system called recovery time. So this is going to be this counter up here in the top right. Currently for this unit it is 0, but if we go to anybody else it will be a different number. Now you may notice that this may look a little bit different from what you're used to. So the recovery time system is what was used in the Tactics Ogre PSP version, as well as the One Vision mod, as well as Tactics Ogre Reborn. The system has remained the same. It is the other stuff around it that changed. The system itself remains the same as it always was, namely essentially game ticks that are constantly counting down to 0, at which point units will get their turn. Now, with that being said, calculating it is actually something that you really don't realistically want to be doing, but you want to be paying attention to the stuff that it does. And I should also probably point out one more little thing before I forget about it later. The SNES, PS1, and Saturn version used a different system, in which your character's weight was still considered for your wait time, but you simply got a speed bonus if you didn't move or you didn't act. The nitty-gritty stuff that we're going to be talking about here is coming from the PSP version, again, to One Vision to Reborn. It's going to be all of the three best versions of the game. Anyway, so let's go ahead and continue here. Actually, I didn't mention Knight of Lotus, but that was like a turn-based system, and then your weight affected your movement range, so it's kind of its own other thing there. Alright, so let's discuss. What exactly affects your recovery time? Because again, remember, it is just game ticks that are counting down to 0, at which point you get your turn. So the main thing that you're going to be interacting with in most situations is going to be your movement range. So if we take a look down here at the bottom, notice that our Valkyrie is currently about halfway through the bar, and will be taking her turn relatively soonish. If we take one tile of movement over here, it's not really going to affect the turn order any, but if we take 2 tiles of movement, we see that we are now moving after the cleric. If we take a longer movement, we see that we're now a couple spaces past the cleric, and if we decide to take a really long move, then we see that we're practically off the edge of the screen. Every tile that you move is going to increase the length of time that it takes for your next turn to come up. Additionally, every action that you take, whether it's from the skill menu or a primary action like swinging your weapon, will have a recovery time associated with it. So, for example, if we take a look at this Caldia, we see that it's listed as having a weight of 2 and a recovery time of 8. Again, depending on which version you're playing, this might be different. Right now I'm playing the One Vision mod, but this will be essentially the same for every one of those 3 newest versions. So recovery time is how much is added as soon as you take that action, and then weight is basically your passive recovery time. So your natural recovery time is determined by the character itself, so most generics will have a flat recovery time. Special characters, depending on who they are, will have a different recovery time as well. So for example, Ozma is ridiculously speedy, whereas somebody like Chamos is actually slower than a generic. Now, that being said, bear in mind that recovery time, while it seems like having your turn come up immediately is always better, it's not, in an ideal world it would be, but it's not always the case. Sometimes you specifically want to manipulate your speed to cut off somebody after a turn, like let's say there's a healer, and you know that you want to attack them right after they've healed, or for example, you know that they're going to be distracted, so you want to attack them beforehand. Other times you want to cut them off before their action. Part of the big kind of a strategy layout of Tactics Ogre is cutting people off at the right time. Not just cutting them off, not just letting them go, but knowing and figuring out when to cut off whom and when and how, right? Anyway, so with that being said, as far as this goes, every action will have a specific recovery time associated with it. Like swinging this magic orb over here will count as 4 recovery time. This will be 1 recovery time. If we look at somebody with a shield and mace, typically shields are going to be dramatically faster than a standard weapon, but again, this will vary. And this is especially true in Reborn. If you've ever noticed the AI running around and shield bashing, that's strictly because they saw the damage that they wanted to do, and they saw the opportunity to save some time while doing it. Alright, that being said, your equipment also has weight, so that's going to be this number over here. And weight is essentially just stacked on top of your natural recovery time. So on top of your person's natural recovery time, their class has a specific recovery time, and on top of that, you have their carried equipment. So this will be the kind of static number that is always with them at all times. Whenever their turn comes up, that's the cost that they've already paid to start their next turn. This can be kind of hard to figure out, since a lot of times when a character is about to act, or even if you interrupt it immediately at the right time, you'll notice that just their numbers can be all over the place. Sometimes 50 recovery time will pass in, half a second. Other times you have everybody at recovery times from like 130 to 120 all just stacked up on top of another. This is why little differences in that number can sometimes matter a lot. Other times it won't matter very much at all. And one thing to correct real quick is that there is no kind of sanity check that's forcing somebody to take, let's say only a certain amount of actions per recovery time. It's just recovery time goes down, recovery time goes down. There have been different versions of that sanity check in different games, but typically Tactics Ogre has always been pretty freeform about it. This is actually hilariously why, if you abused the zombie mechanic back in the SNES version, you could give somebody 500 plus turns without ever actually being forced to let the other guy act. It got pretty comical. Anyway, so really the main things that are going to be determining how long it takes for somebody to act are going to be your essentially your movement range during your turn, as well as your action. So like, let's say we try to use a recruit here, and we hang on, how much recovery time is recruit looking at in this case? Looks like a recovery time of about 10. So we go ahead and let's say waste a recruit over here. If you didn't know, if you are playing something like One Vision or PSP, if you use Recruit on a friendly unit, even though it has 0% chance to succeed, you actually do train it a little bit. Anyway, so we see that we are now lower in the turn order because of it, and if we were to take a longer move all the way over here, we would see that, again, we would already be off the turn order entirely. If we were to take a swing with our weapon over here, we would once again be off of our turn order entirely. That Caldy is actually pretty quick to swing, so not so much in her case, I suppose. But anyways, that's the general idea, though, that every time that you're going and acting, you want to try to minimize your movements as much as possible if you're trying to be fast. So this, again, can vary a decent bit depending on your situation. So what are some situations that you'd, for example, want to be slower? Well, let's say, you know how I mentioned earlier that somebody like Ozma being faster isn't always necessarily a good thing? Well, when it comes to characters getting knocked out, like let's say a character's about to bleed out, you might notice someone like Ozma is far more likely to bleed out from her injuries than, for example, a Chamos there, where being faster in an innate sense means that somebody is going to reach the end of their bleed out timer that much faster. Which actually, on that note, I don't believe I mentioned this earlier, but when it comes to when a character is knocked out, they actually will reach the maximum possible for their recovery time, and each of their turns will again be that maximum possible. So this means that typically characters will take a lot longer to bleed out than it would be for them to take those turns naturally. But additionally, if a character is slower, this can be really beneficial in this situation. So whether, for example, you're in Reborn and are just looking for the exactly right time to go bring somebody back for a big counterattack, or if you're in the earlier versions and you're not sure, like, for example, when to, let's say in One Vision, use something like a lifeline gem to go bring somebody back, how much time you have before you have to sacrifice one of your units to save someone, that kind of stuff. Typically, obviously, this will vary in a lot of situations, but typically it's going to be a pretty good number to keep in mind. Now, with that all being said, let's talk about speed in general. How exactly can you make sure that you're always outspeeding the other guy? Because this is actually something that I've brought up a lot in various challenge run videos. For example, when I'm talking about delaying somebody by pushing them backwards, on paper it seems like a pretty worthless action, because you're effectively just pushing the unit backwards or whatever else. But something like a shield bash is actually a great way to get a speed advantage. If you are getting decent enough damage off that shield, if you're maybe throwing somebody off a cliff, if you're just dealing okay damage with the shield itself, oftentimes what you can find is that you will end up delaying that other guy pretty significantly. Because let's say, for example, somebody's standing over here, like they just got around this corner, right? And you're standing right here. if you manage to, let's say, knock back a unit back onto the bottom of this cliff, and they then are looking at this, they don't feel like they can make this jump for whatever reason, and so then they have to take all these other tiles to go around. So not only have you damaged them for free, you've also forced them to take a lot of extra actions to get there. In many situations, that could be exactly what you need to gain a speed advantage. Obviously, again, things will vary depending on your situation. Sometimes you want to be faster, sometimes you want to be slower. But in general, it's good to bear in mind what your speed options can be. Because one answer definitely does not fit all. And knowing when to delay somebody at the exactly right time could be the difference between a resounding win and getting your ass kicked. So there's that too. Especially if you're playing something like One Vision here, where oftentimes you'll find that the AI feels like it's going ridiculously fast on you. And that's simply put because you're in just kind of a bad spot terrain-wise. Pulling back, letting enemies come to you, let's say taking attacks with a chance of knockback, all of these things are ways to go and delay enemies from reaching you. So keep those in mind next time you're wondering why it is that you're getting outsped so dang bad, because oftentimes it's just a simple matter of making them come to you, or potentially taking your attacks as counterattacks. Because one more thing to bear in mind for recovery time is that every action is just the recovery time of the thing that you're doing itself. So like, let's say you're taking a look at your weapons, right? And it would be fair to assume, it's like, oh, if I swing this weapon, well, if I'm doing a finisher, I'm also swinging that weapon. It must be using the same recovery, it must be adding it on top of it. But no, your finishers and your weapons are two separate things. Essentially, just using that skill is already going and having a recovery time of its own. Those things are not as linked as we would assume that they would be. So just, again, bear that in mind. Also, probably should have, it's fine. Whatever. Anyway, though, let's see what else. So there's also obviously skills that are going to speed things up or down. Stuff like haste will end up speeding up your unit's countdown. Stuff like slow will end up slowing it down. But additionally, you have other moves that will go and delay them. So oftentimes things like moves that have leaden on them and whatnot will be able to potentially inflict a slowdown of some variety. These are especially prevalent, once again, with the One Vision mod, though you do see a few of those in Reborn every now and then. But oftentimes, if you see a unit fidgeting for a second and then nothing else seems to happen, that usually means that they have been hit with a slowdown. So this can oftentimes be used to absolutely hold a unit in place. Like, for example, one of the Gremlin abilities in the official versions will have that slowdown effect on there, and especially if you're playing the PSP version, it can potentially lock units permanently from taking a turn if it's continuously spammed by a couple of them. So just, again, know that that is something that exists, something that you may potentially run into at some point, and everything is only as broken as you let it be. For example, when it comes to these speed-up moves, oftentimes you'll find that these speedier units, if they're slowed down, they oftentimes can be just as slow as your chunky guys. And additionally, a lot of times when it comes to faster units, they're usually sacrificing something to achieve that speed, so usually they're sacrificing defense or what have you. So remember to exploit that. Additionally, then, if you happen to have, let's say, a unit that happens to have higher health and lower speed, you can also abuse that by anything that takes a lot of time to get around. So, for example, they're particularly vulnerable to things like we mentioned before, knockbacks or anything that affects their movement in any way. Especially if you happen to put a barricade of any description in their way, you'll find that they have a really hard time coming back from that. So, just know that is that's something that's there. Let's see, is there anything else to really cover on recovery time? Generally speaking, you want to try to hold position as much as possible. Well, obviously, there's going to be some situations that you want to go ahead and charge. Fights can oftentimes very quickly turn around on you if you decide to go charge ahead to go for one big dramatic win or what have you. So just bear that in mind as best as you can. It is a very, very good idea to let somebody come to you most of the time. There's, again, going to be exceptions, but just never assume that you're going to go get freebie turns, Alright, anyway, so that's about that. That is recovery time in a nutshell. Hopefully that helps to explain it for you, and if you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. Y'all have yourselves a good one, and take care.